This meeting is now being recorded.
Okay, very pleased today to have my colleague Laura Grego talking to us, and she's going to be talking about a new report that she headed and that George and I both worked on. So, Laura. Let's make sure that Laura's not, hold on a second.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah, there you go, okay.
Hi.
Yep, go ahead.
Okay, well, thanks everyone for joining the webinar, and I'm really pleased to have both of my co-authors of this report on the call, so they may be able to field questions as well. So I'm going to mostly cover a report I wrote with David and George that we released last year. The report is pretty lengthy. The main body is 40 pages, and we have 3 or 4 times that in detailed appendices available online. So I won't get through everything in the short time we have together, but I'll try to hit some of the main points and encourage you to take a look at the report yourself if you're more interested in some of the details. And while a lot of you, in looking at this list, know quite a bit about missile defenses and may have worked on the topic over decades, please do indulge just a few minutes of background so that I can keep everyone else with us and anyone who might watch the webinar later. In the nuclear realm, offense and defense are strongly tied together strategically. And the United States has pursued defenses against long-range ballistic missiles since at least the 1950s. Concerns about a possible arms race and dangerous instabilities resulting from offense-defense competition led the U.S. and the Soviet Union to sign the 1972 ABM Treaty, which, quote, prohibited the deployment of ABM systems for the defense of the nation's entire territory. And the ABM Missile Treaty of 1972 held for 30 years. However, in March 1983, President Ronald Reagan announced the Strategic Defense Initiative, an expansive effort to protect the entire United States against a full-scale attack of long-range ballistic missiles. SDI came to be nicknamed Star Wars. The original SDI concept involved a range of ambitious proposals such as X-ray lasers and other space-based weapons, and was focused on the unachievable goal of providing an impenetrable barrier against the huge Soviet arsenal, which would thereby make nuclear weapons impotent and obsolete. As cost estimates and technical challenges mounted, it scaled back the plans through the next the next administration, George H.W. Bush, continued scaling back. So while strategic missile defense research programs continued to evolve and change names, eventually they came back to Earth to concentrate on ground-based interceptors, and that's what we'll be talking about today. It was not until 2001 that the ABM Treaty would yield. In 2001, George W. Bush announced that the U.S. would withdraw and end the treaty. And soon after, he charged the Pentagon with rapidly fielding a homeland missile defense system with the goal of having an initial operational capability in late 2004. The heart of this system was to be the Ground-based Midcourse Defense System, which I will refer to as the GMD. The GMD system is intended to defend the entire United States homeland, the 50 states, against attack by long-range ballistic missiles. These missiles would be launched from thousands of miles away in an arced trajectory that carries them out of the atmosphere into the vacuum of space before they re-enter and fall to their targets under the force of gravity. The Bush administration stated its rationale for rushing the GMD system into the field, that it was a response to the ballistic missile programs of rogue states, such as North Korea. While the decision to go ahead so quickly was controversial, the U.S. political climate after the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001, made it very difficult for Congress or others to question executive decisions about defense and security matters, and so the project proceeded. As this GMD system approached its decade birthday after the initial 2004 declaration of capability, we decided to take a look back and to evaluate just what we had reaped from this effort. I'm going to give you the spoiler. Basically, we found that the system was in much worse condition than most people thought, and that this was an entirely predictable consequence of how the system came about. It was a massively funded effort of a highly political system executed under limited oversight. Today, nearly 15 years later, the program's price tag is $40 billion and counting. Its test record is poor, and it has demonstrated no ability to stop an incoming missile under real-world conditions. Insufficient oversight has not only exacerbated the GMD system's problems, but we believe they have obscured their full extent. And our concern is that this could encourage politicians and military leaders to make decisions that actually increase the risk of a missile attack against the United States. So the report really goes over how did we end up in this position. And before I do that, I just want to make sure we're all on the same technical page, so a quick rundown of how the system works. The job of the GMD system is to detect the launch of an enemy ICBM, so a long-range missile, beyond 5,500 kilometers. Missiles of this range have to go up quite high, up to 1,000 kilometers, and this is so around 75 or 100 kilometers is where the atmosphere essentially ends for our purposes, so it really spends most of its time traveling through space. Countries such as Iran and North Korea need missiles with these ranges to strike the U.S. So the ICBMs spend just a few minutes in powered flight or boost, but most of the journey is on ballistic flight up above 100 kilometers. So here's how it's supposed to operate, the GMD system, if used against a missile launch from North Korea toward the western United States. The first notice of the missile launch, so you'll see these, I'm sorry that they're small, but it's numbered in time order. The first notice of the missile launch would come from sensors on early warning satellites detecting the bright plume of the launching missile and from forward-based radars. Each of these sensors would detect the missile within about a minute or less after launch begins. The information from these sensors will be relayed to the GMD fire control centers at Fort Greely in Alaska and Schriever Air Force Base in Colorado. After accelerating rapidly up through the atmosphere, the attacking missile's booster burns out roughly 3 to 5 minutes after launch begins. Now in the vacuum of space, the missile releases its warhead and any decoys and other intentional countermeasures it may carry. In the vacuum of space, these free-falling objects, such as the warhead and decoys, travel at the same speed regardless of mass. We call the collection of those objects the threat cloud. And as the threat cloud coasts through space, it would next be detected by a ground-based tracking radar, in this case the upgraded Cobra-Dane radar on Shemya Island at the western end of the Aleutian Island chain. And then the sea-based X-band radar, which is a large radar built on an ocean-going self-propelled platform, if it has actually been moved in position. It normally is home-ported in Hawaii. So both of these large radars are capable of providing tracking data accurate enough to be used for launching and guiding the missile defense interceptors. And finally, as the threat cloud approaches the west coast, it can also be detected and tracked by the upgraded PAVE-PAWS early warning radar at Beale Air Force Base in Northern California. The adversary may use decoys or other countermeasures to try to confuse the defense. For example, the threat cloud may contain numerous lightweight decoy warheads, such as mylar balloons. The warhead itself might be enclosed in a balloon so that the objects appear yet more similar to each other. The job of the GMD system is to try to select the warhead from among these objects. Based on the information from all available sensors, the fire control centers in Alaska and Colorado will attempt to discriminate the warhead from the other objects in the threat cloud, determine its trajectory, calculate potential intercept points, and fire one or more interceptors. The number of the interceptors initially fired will depend on various factors, including whether the operators believe the warhead has been accurately identified among the other objects, or if multiple objects will need to be intercepted, and whether there will be time to fire a second round of interceptors after observing the results of the first. The interceptors launch from underground silos in 2 sites, Fort Greely in Alaska, or there are a few in Vandenberg Air Force Base in California. The total interceptors currently are 34, soon to be 44, projected by the end of 2017. These interceptors would be accelerated by powerful boosting rockets toward projected intercept points that the Fire Control Center has calculated. After the interceptor's booster rocket burns out above the atmosphere, it releases a small exo-atmospheric kill vehicle, EKV, so I'll either refer to it as an EKV or kill vehicle, that has a mass of about 55 kilograms. The kill vehicle's infrared sensor detects and begins to track the threat cloud. The kill vehicle will attempt to select one of the objects as the target using the live data from its sensor's 2 infrared detectors. from pre-programmed information about what it expects to see of the warhead and other objects, plus any information that the ground can manage to communicate. The kill vehicle then fires small rocket thrusters called divert thrusters to maneuver itself toward the target to destroy it in a high-speed collision. Finally, the GMD system sensors will attempt to perform a kill assessment, that is to determine whether the enemy warhead was successfully destroyed. If the warhead's destruction can't be confirmed and enough time remains, the GMD system may fire additional interceptors toward the incoming threat cloud. This entire sequence of events, from the launch of the attacking missile to the intercept and the destruction of the warhead, or the warhead's impact on its target if interception fails, would take no more than about a half an hour. Okay, so that's how it's meant to work. Back to the matter at hand, how did the system get built? While the initial research and development of the technology for these ground-based interceptor missiles happened in the previous decade, the Bush administration greatly accelerated the GMD system's development. In late 2001, when the president announced the U.S. would withdraw from the ABM Treaty, and the following year, the administration announced that the newly named Missile Defense Agency would begin building the GMD system. They decided that they announced that they would begin building it, even though most of that technology was still unproven or had only existed in prototypes. What was the justification for the rush? The quick fielding? The president justified this, building the system in a drastically different way than we do other military systems, by arguing that the need for strategic missile defense was acute and there was no time to be wasted. So, to meet this tight deadline, to get a system that works in just a few years, the administration took an unusual step and exempted the system, the missile defense enterprise, from standard time-tested rules developed for developing complex military systems. Now, over decades, Congress and the military have developed well-defined procedures for acquiring major military systems based on repeated lessons that a rigorous system of accountability is necessary to develop them on time and working. Basically, the shorthand for that is fly before you buy. That's meant to prevent premature and expensive fielding of unproven systems. Now, normal development of a major defense acquisition program follows a requirements process that establishes via the Joint Chiefs of Staff that a capability is needed to mitigate a specific threat or to support a specific strategic goal. Once that requirement is set, it's followed by a process that compares alternatives for getting that capability, and it compares them with respect to efficacy and cost. Once that solution is identified, then the acquisitions process provides a roadmap to building that chosen system. And that roadmap has specific milestones that demonstrate to Congress and other decision makers that the system works as intended under realistic conditions. All this is meant to happen before proceeding to produce and buy the system. But instead, in 2002, Secretary Rumsfeld delegated much of the oversight process to the very organization that is developing the GMD system, the Missile Defense Agency. Rumsfeld gave the Missile Defense Agency the authority to set its own requirements, to review its own performance against these requirements, and to consolidate, establish, and cancel programs at will without outside review. He also exempted the Missile Defense Agency from standard reporting requirements about programs' progress and cost, making it difficult for outsiders, for Congress and other reviewers to see how the progress was going and what we were buying for the money. Additionally, and one of the most important things, this process created a shortcut to the field for missile defense equipment by exempting it from the obligation to satisfy these standard acquisitions milestones and from completing operational testing before deployment. Instead, Rumsfeld said the MDA should use prototype and test assets to provide early capability. So we could put, rather than testing equipment first, it could be fielded. Pentagon officials at the time said that the experimental nature of missile defense made it nearly impossible to produce meaningful cost or schedule estimates, and therefore required a lot of flexibility. Accordingly, some members of Congress and others were skeptical. Senator Jack Reed said at the time, quote, "You get the suspicion this is as much to avoid scrutiny of the program as it is to shield it from adversaries." Indeed, the exemptions introduced by Rumsfeld in January 2002 allowed the Pentagon to field poorly tested equipment, and the haste resulting from Bush's December 2002 directive ensured this would be the case. Today, this poorly tested equipment makes up key parts of the fielded GMD system. So to get an idea of how this played out, I'll take you through the development of a key piece of equipment, the exo-atmospheric kill vehicle, and that's a picture of what you're seeing here. The kill vehicles are complicated and hand-built pieces of equipment with more than 100,000 process steps to build or to take them apart. Repairs are costly, and they can make the kill vehicle vulnerable to quality control failures. But this was what we started with. Rather than going through this requirements process and development process, these are essentially prototypes that are put into the field. So mandated by the administration to achieve an operational capability by the end of 2004, the MDA began deploying interceptors with an untested operational version of this kill vehicle called the Capability Enhancement 1 version, so I'll call that CE1 kill vehicle. And they were started to deploy these in the summer of 2004. Since the program was exempted from the usual acquisition rules, no fly-before-you-buy requirements were in place to prevent this rush. No successful tests were required before putting them into the field. Once having put those initial interceptors into the field, in December 2004, there were 8 deployed interceptors. At this point, the Missile Defense Agency could have paused its deployment to allow testing of the kill vehicle, but it didn't. It continued to add kill vehicles to the field while delaying testing. And the result of doing that was that the MDA fielded nearly all of the CE1 kill vehicles it planned to deploy, around 24, before conducting a single successful intercept test of that design. The first successful destruction of a test target by an operationally configured interceptor did not take place until late September 2007. Nearly 3 years after.
Laura, can you?
Yes.
Laura, let me just break in. I think the first time people see this chart, it can sometimes be confusing, and I think it's actually really interesting if you understand what it is. Can you just run through a little more explicitly what the curves are showing, what the axes are?
Sure. Okay. So the x-axis is time. So from first deployment to a couple years ago, and I see it isn't. I'm sorry, I lost the axes on this. Sorry about that. So these are deployed interceptors. So the blue curve, I'm sorry that some of you can't see them. The blue curve is CE1 kill vehicles, CE1 equipped interceptors that have been deployed. So these are ground-based interceptors, and these are cumulative numbers. So here at the end of 2004, there were 8 interceptors deployed. Here, at the first failed test in 2006, there were 12 or 13. And by 2007, the first 24 kill vehicles, CE1 kill vehicles, were deployed, and that was the date of the first successful. Nearby was the date of the first successful test of that type. As I'll mention in a minute, there's a second curve here, which is a CE2 interceptors. So pretty quickly after building this first set of interceptors, the Missile Defense Agency realized that that a number of components were obsolete and they were not going to be able to maintain or repair CE1 kill vehicles, so they started designing a second one, a CE2. So as you'll see in 2008, those started to be deployed as well. And you can see, and marked on the chart are intercept tests, not flight tests, but intercept tests, marked a long time as well. So what you're seeing is that, so for in this first curve up to the full deployment of the CE1 kill vehicles happened before a successful test of that design. And what I was about to mention is the same thing happened with the CE2 kill vehicles. They started to be deployed 2008. Failed a test in January of 2010 and failed a test in December of 2010. And at that point, deployment was halted. Yeah. So what might just take a moment and move back to some of these tests, which are fairly interesting, and there's a lot more information in the report, of course, about them. In January 2010, this was attributed to a quality. The failure was attributed to a quality control failure, in which an improperly installed wire harness led to the failure of one of the divert thrusters. So, as I mentioned, they're very complicated pieces of equipment, 100,000 process steps. It's unclear what happened, but how that happened. But the assessment was that it was basically somebody missed a step. So the issue with that is later in December 2010, it was failed for really a design issue rather than a quality control problem. It failed because of a design issue. The system didn't cope well with the vibrations induced by the combustion of the divert thrusters, leading it to miss its target. This track gate anomaly, it was called a track gate, anyways, described as a track gate anomaly. This problem had been observed in tests for at least a decade, and it inspired hardware and software fixes, but it was the first time it had made a intercept to miss its target. Whether they would have been able to observe that in the January 2010 test is an open question, but certainly because the January 2010 test failed because of a quality control issue, they couldn't have seen this problem. So I think these problems slowed down the progress in developing a working system. In fact, this problem may have been controversial at the time, but I think most officials have come around to the point in recognizing that the rush to deploy the system on a politically driven timetable is a primary source of the problems that still plague the system. According to the Undersecretary of Defense for Procurement, Frank Kendall, a couple of years ago, he admitted that the problems we've had with the currently fielded interceptors was a desire to field them very quickly and very cheaply, and that the detailed engineering that should have been applied really wasn't there. As you look at this chart, I think the most striking thing about it is that nearly all of the 30 deployed ground-based interceptors were placed in silos before a single intercept test of their type had ever been successfully carried out. Nevertheless, in March 2013, the Secretary of Defense, Chuck Hagel, announced that in response to advances in the North Korean ballistic missile program, 14 additional interceptors would be fielded by the end of 2017. His announcement significantly increased the pressure to get interceptors fielded. Just as in the GMD system's first decade, a timeline imposed by considerations other than technical maturity was driving deployment. And I think that this really will continue to affect the quality of the system. For example, all of the currently deployed CE-1 and CE-2 equipped interceptors need upgrades and fixes to address the problems uncovered in the test failures. But however, to meet the 2017 deadline, as well as to offset some of the unplanned expenses of fixing the CE-2 kill vehicles, the Missile Defense Agency plans to delay completion of fixing the track gate anomaly problem in the fielded CE-2 interceptors until late 2016, and I'm not sure. George may be able to tell us if that's been completed. And some of the fixes won't happen at all because the MGA is planning to basically start over and design a new kill vehicle and replace.
Laura, Mark has a question for clarification here about the tests, asking whether these are flight tests or only intercept tests.
Only intercept tests.
As you've shown in the chart.
Yes. Right. I'm sorry. I lost the label markers. Because the Missile Defense Agency is redesigning the kill vehicle, some of them just won't be replaced. So I think the conclusion, basically, from this graph and from this short descriptive story of the interceptors is that the kill vehicles will continue to suffer, both from known problems that have plagued the system for years and potentially from those that have yet to be uncovered because the testing is limited and interceptors, and the priority has been to get interceptors into the field. So despite the fact that reliable kill vehicles are the key to a working system, the U.S. is accepting a high level of risk from problem-ridden and untested hardware just to keep to an artificially strict schedule, whether it was imposed from the from the Bush administration or the Obama administration. In response to the many failures of the kill vehicles, in 2015, the Obama administration began a new program to redesign the kill vehicles, as I just mentioned. This redesign is meant to use a modular design to increase reliability and try to hopefully head off some of those process problems. My concern, though, is that while a very dependable kill vehicle is needed, it's not clear that this process will be more successful in the absence of better acquisition rigor and oversight. While some changes have certainly been made in the past administration to improve oversight, there still are, still can move things very quickly to the field and still don't need to meet all these milestones in the same way to complete operational testing, for example. So the pace set for the RKV's development is unrealistic, I think. It's sort of comparable to the last set. The first RKV flight test, reliable kill vehicle flight test, would be in 2018, and an intercept test is planned for 2019. Then fielding would begin in 2020. According to the Government Accountability Office, this RKV initiative marks the 7th time in 15 years that the Missile Defense Agency has made a major effort to fix the kill vehicle. So far at great expense and without clear success.
Laura, there's a question that may be worth addressing. And the question is, he says, can you tell us what the test consisted of, and in particular, how close is the test to a real ICBM launch targeting North America? So it's really about the operational, how operationally realistic the tests are.
Yeah, well, that's coming up. So I won't address that now, but it's in the next couple of slides that will be focused. So if you have further questions after that, let me know. So quickly moving to a little closer look at this GMD intercept test. So yes, I'm not including any of the flight tests in this chart. These are just attempts of the system to actually intercept and destroy a warhead in a test. So there are flight tests which can be used to confirm changes to the design or prove different capabilities, but this is really the bread and butter of a test system. So marked in green are the successes. Marked in red are the failures. There have been 17 tests since really the inception of this program, although a large proportion of them were using prototype kill vehicles. I think what's striking is that you'll notice that the test record is not improving, which is what you'd really want and expect to a program that is proving its worth and that is maturing. Only in 9 of the 17 tests did the kill vehicle, in 9 of the 17 tests, the kill vehicle failed to destroy the target. In tests of the operationally configured interceptors, only 3 out of 7 have been successful. Another way to look at this is that the majority of the interceptors fielded today use the CE-2 kill vehicle. So the fourth column here indicates the flavor of the interceptor's kill vehicle, either CE-1 or CE-2. The CE-1 kill vehicle has a test record of 2 out of 4, with the last test of a refurbished variant failing in 2014. And the rest use a CE-2 kill vehicle, which has only had a single intercept success in 3 tries. So the Pentagon's testing agency, the Director of Operational Test and Evaluation, made this comment after publishing an in-depth study in 2014 of the ballistic missile defense enterprise, and said the reliability and availability of the operational GBIs is low, and the Missile Defense Agency continues to discover new failure modes during testing. I'd say that's an accurate summation of what you see here. Now, but what is at least as important as a failing test record is that the tests were not conducted under operational conditions, which are certain to be challenging. Instead, in each test, the missile defenders had significant information about the time and place of the target's launch and how the target and any other objects would look. The conditions varied little and were optimized for success. Yet, even without being subjected to these challenging conditions, the GMD system has failed more than half the time. So far, there's been no test against an ICBM range target. There is one scheduled for sometime between April and June of this year. That would be the first test against a target with the speed and range of an ICBM. There has been no tests using salvos of interceptors, and by that I mean using more than one interceptor to try to destroy a target. If you have a system which has low effectiveness, and our system does, one strategy for improving your outcome is to shoot more than one interceptor against a given target. So if one fails, the others might succeed. We haven't tested that mode yet. We haven't used, for this system, we haven't tested against salvos of targets, so trying to destroy more than one target launched at the same time and seeing if that affects your effectiveness. As I mentioned, the refurbished EKV, which was the last CE1 EKV test in 2014, which didn't succeed, that has not been yet successfully demonstrated to work. And the testing conditions have been limited. The lighting has been the same in each test. Only one test, and that was a failure, had been conducted during a night launch. If you look at the timing of all of the tests, the target is lit by the sun against the dark background. The weather, the weather is generally good. And there have been no tests using complex countermeasures. So there's been only one successful test that has used, as far as we know, that have used countermeasures at all, but nothing that's been very stressful for the system. So what I'm showing here is this is from the report of the Director of Operational Test and Evaluation report on missile defense that I mentioned. So this is from 2014. So a good system, basically, this is an operational realism chart. So the DOT&E has some figures of merit it has come up with to assess the test program's adequacy, about how realistic it is. And these 9 metrics are, you can go down here, using operationally representative interceptors, threat representative targets, complex countermeasures, operational sensors, operational fire control software, warfighter approved tactics, techniques and procedures, warfighter participation, and unannounced target launch, and end-to-end test. So you can see, so this is a test, so the GMD system, and this is just from tests since 2010, is not even necessarily failing. It's not always even trying to meet these operational criteria. I would actually, I would suggest even digging into these a little further. For example, one category is unannounced target launch. I'm not sure that means exactly what it appears to mean, considering that all the intercept tests, save one, were done with the target illuminated by the sun against a dark background. So certainly those participating in the test had some ideas about what time the test might happen. So using this information, the Director of Operational Test and Evaluation's assessment is that the tests to date are, quote, insufficient to demonstrate that an operationally useful defense capability exists. Now, to address this, the Missile Defense Agency currently plans 10 more GMD flight tests through fiscal year 24, including a salvo engagement test, including a test engaging multiple simultaneous threats, and later this year an ICBM engagement test. So aware of these deficiencies, but currently where we're at, they have not been tested. And this is just the assessment. Again, insufficient to demonstrate that an operationally useful defense capability exists. So a good testing is not only crucial for the ability to develop a working system, as opposed to the practice that's been with this program, which is put your interceptors in place, test it. When you find a failure, haul those interceptors back up and fix them. That's certainly, designing a good testing system is certainly critical for building your system that works as well as it can. It's also critical for understanding how well the system that you have works. And so I thought I'd take a minute to just explain this a little in more detail. Because a strategic missile defense system is expected to be highly effective, because it has to work against an existential threat and it has to work the first time that it's used. For example, even with an extremely high single-shot kill probability, so meaning if you target with one interceptor, if you think that you'll destroy it with a probability of 95%, even with that, the probability of at least one warhead getting through in an attack of 5 missiles using one-on-one targeting is perhaps surprisingly high, almost 1 in 4. So with your testing system, you can rapidly know by a series of failures that your kill probability is low. But to gain confidence that your system works well and to get a better quantification, it does require a good number of tests. One issue that the system faces is that live fire tests are time-consuming and expensive. They cost around $200 million each. So the Missile Defense Agency has put a great deal of effort into creating models of the system, anchored with data from live tests. And this approach does make sense within the parameter space that's already been tested, though it has obvious drawbacks when you're trying to extrapolate beyond these conditions. For example, the most recent failure of this CE-2 kill vehicle concerned a problem with the guidance system that had appeared in numerous previous tests, but only resulted in missing the target during this last test, which was testing it under a longer time of flight, so beyond the envelope of previous tests. So in reality, the GMD system is complex and requires a number of major systems, not only working well on their own, but working well together and under conditions expected to be challenging and variable. That was sort of the ground we just covered. And so we expect a single-shot kill probability of 95% to be very difficult to achieve. So then we turn to other targeting strategies. So it's crucial to know as much as possible about the interceptor's reliability and effectiveness, because it has specific practical consequences for how you actually might use it. At present, the actual kill probability is undoubtedly quite low, judging from the test record. So then you think, well, you'd want to use a strategy of using more than one interceptor against a target, so you can make up for the poor performance. And so this is just an estimate of the probability that at least one warhead survives in an attack of 5 warheads using the system. And so the targeting scheme is either 1 interceptor on 1 target, 2 interceptors on 1 target, or 4 on 1. And that appears to be about, at least in the public literature, about the limit that you can do due to confusion. You can't target infinite numbers of interceptors on a single warhead, at least only at one time. So in the second column is the single-shot kill probability. And in the third column is the probability at least one warhead gets through. And you can see that while you can make up some ground by targeting a warhead with more than one interceptor, it really doesn't buy you all that much until your reliability is pretty good. For example, in a scenario of 5 warheads, it's clear that 4-on-1 targeting can't make up much ground for ineffective interceptors, like with a kill probability of 0.25. 4-on-1 targeting still lets at least one warhead through 85% of the time. And you look down towards the bottom of the graph for interceptors, with a kill probability of 90, will defeat all incoming warheads 95% of the time with 4-on-1 targeting. So a good testing program really does need to tell you enough about your system that you know that you can make good decisions about how you would use it and when you would use it. However, it isn't at all clear that the poor test record of the system and the limited knowledge we have of its capabilities is affected in official rhetoric about the system. Now there's, the judgment from the Director of Operational Test and Evaluation, because U.S. officials regularly praise the GMD as a working system. For example, this was the Director of the Missile Defense Agency back in 2010, stating that the probability will be well in the high 90s today of the GMD system being able to intercept a missile launched from Tehran to New York. Not too long after that, the White House Press Secretary Jay Carney stated that the U.S. is fully capable of defending against any North Korean ballistic missile attack. My concern is that if political and military leaders believe the GMD system works better than it does, it can be a grave problem. It might lead to pursuit of more aggressive policies in a crisis, which might lead to increasing the risk of nuclear exchange. And I'm also equally worried about an over-optimistic view of the capabilities of strategic missile defenses, diminishing the incentive to vigorously pursue other and potentially more effective approaches to the thorny problem of ballistic missiles, maybe not as vigorous diplomacy as they would pursue otherwise. So the question is, I'm running up against time limits, but what's next for the system? We have a new administration, which will probably carry over the previous plans to redesign and replace the kill vehicles and to improve the boosters for the interceptors and to build a new discrimination radar. Current policy on the White House website states that, quote, we will also develop a state-of-the-art missile defense to protect against missile-based attacks from states like Iran and North Korea. So I think important in there is noting that it's still targeted against Iran and North Korea and not pure threats. And the White House has announced that it will conduct a review of ballistic missile defenses, which will include cruise and hypersonic defense, and that is meant to be completed by next January. Quickly moving to with Congress's role. Congress does have its own ideas about what to be doing and to spend money on. While I would argue that Congress didn't provide adequate oversight and skepticism for the GMD system, it goes a little further than this. Missile defense advocates in Congress have tried to compel the Pentagon to build a third interceptor deployment site in the eastern half of the U.S. that could host up to 60 additional GMD interceptors. Every year since 2012, Congress has attempted to dedicate or earmark money to build such a site, despite Pentagon budgets that have never included a dime for it. And when asked, missile defense officials have repeatedly said that they have higher priorities for the next dollar and are skeptical what this expensive project would do to their own priorities, considering that they expect budget constraints to continue. They prefer to improve the reliability and effectiveness of the existing system, and I think that's right. And the Missile Defense Agency has repeatedly stated that the current system provides defensive coverage for the entire homeland against limited long-range ballistic missile attacks from North Korea or Iran. So far, Congress has been unable to overcome that lack of support from the Missile Defense Agency. So instead, Congress has settled for requiring the Pentagon to study potential sites and mandate it when it completes these studies to identify a preferred one. The site study was on track to conclude in 2016, and the results of this study are meant to be released in early 2017, so it could happen anytime. The congressional delegations from these sites, the three remaining sites which are in play, one is in Fort Custer in Michigan, Camp Ravenna in Ohio, and Fort Drum in New York. The congressional delegations, with very few exceptions, cross party lines and asked the Missile Defense Agency to support locating the site in their respective states. That support appears to be largely driven by an interest in creating jobs. And generally, the Missile Defense Agency has been uninterested in this. We expect once there's a preferred site in hand that Congress will push for funding for it, and I don't know what this administration will do, whether it will support such an effort or not. And the last thing I wanted to mention was that missile defense advocates in Congress have not rested there. So this is the 1999 Missile Defense Act, which was passed after intense debate and discussion. And this set out Congress's preferred principles by which missile defense would be conducted. It was the United States should deploy as soon as technologically possible an effective national missile defense system defending against limited ballistic missile attack. So importantly, strategic missile defense is really only aimed at non-peer states such as Iran or North Korea. And this limit was meant to make clear that the system would not be targeted at near-peer arsenals such as Russia. However, last year in budget deliberations in the House, Representative Trent Franks passed a surprise amendment revising the National Missile Defense Act of 1999 to remove the words effective and limited and inserted language supporting a robust layered defense. On the other side of Congress, Senator Ted Cruz passed an amendment that simply removed the word limited. Notably, these changes are happening with none of the public debate that happened in 1999. In news reports, Franks practically bragged about the lack of debate, saying maybe if some people had understood what they were voting for, the Democrats would have resisted. So what this does, by removing the scope of limited, it paves the way. It doesn't mandate, but it paves the way to expand missile defenses to be targeted against larger peer arsenals. And so lastly, there's an enormous amount of detail collected in our report. I could only touch on some of it. I know I went through it quickly, but here's the address of the website, and you can reach all the appendices and read whatever I was unable to cover today. And I think I'll leave it there and look for questions.
Okay, thank you. Start off with Steve Fetter, who had a couple of questions. Steve, I'm going to unmute you if you want to go ahead and ask your question.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Yes.
So I was wondering what press or congressional outreach you did and what the response to that was. When I first saw the report, I suggested to a colleague that they ask MDA to respond, and MDA said, well, we're not receiving, the report has not received much interest, so there's no need to respond.
Interesting. So we did press, sort of normal press outreach. There was an article in Reuters and in the LA Times that were circulated.
Any congressional interest?
Mostly, right. So we spoke to the Senate Armed Services Committee, and were unable to get an appointment on the House side, although that's still something we plan to do. And we're not finished with it yet, but we didn't. We have a list of people that we still have to engage, and I'd be interested for your suggestions for that. And thanks for that feedback, actually. So they felt no pressure.
Yeah, they thought if they responded, it would just help elevate the story.
Interesting. Okay.
Unfortunately, Stephen Young was on before, and I think he's had to leave. We did send copies of the report out to congressional offices, and Stephen talked to a number of them. But again, I think as Laura said, it's not clear that that was enough to sort of raise it to a high level. I don't think those people then, asked MDA what was going on and things like that.
Well, one of the things, the first sweep through, we really honestly were trying to get some feedback on. So we make some recommendations, right? So it's pretty clear that what the mess is and what the solution is. It seemed to be less clear, and to get specific feedback on what kinds of things we could try to move forward. That was at first pass through, and that was in the fall before the election. I think after the election it's pretty difficult to get attention and to know how to move forward. But so we did talk to the House Armed Forces and Senate, and at the Senate they suggested we go speak to someone at the MDA and get some feedback. And we had a hard time identifying a person who would talk to us about that. But But anyway, we're not done with it, and appreciate that.
Steve, you also had a question about salvage fusing.
Yeah, so high-altitude nuclear explosions have been recognized to be a major problem for missile defense since the 1960s. And that could either be a precursor burst or a salvage fuse warhead, and it would make radar tracking and infrared homing just about impossible on any subsequent vehicle. Have you seen any indication that MDA is focusing attention on that issue?
I haven't. And in fact, I think, you look at, for the operational test and evaluation criteria, I think one of them is survivability. And I think essentially that's what, if I'm not mistaken, that's essentially what that is, and we get very low marks.
Another thing you could do, of course, is attack the radars.
Yes.
So that may be their primary survivability concern.
Right.
George, I just unmuted you if you have a comment on this. If you've seen anything or have looked at...
For example,
go ahead.
Can you hear me? Dave, can you hear me?
Yes,
it's known that the sea-based X-band radar is not EMP hardened, but supposedly the new discrimination radar will be. That's about the only thing I can say about that.
But you haven't seen much in the way of explicit discussion about concerns about this.
No.
Because this would seem to be a really serious problem with mounting a successful defense, if especially defending against nuclear armed missiles.
Yeah, I agree.
I agree, and the fact that the radar capability is not distributed around a large number of radars, I think, they just have, there's the SBX and then the LRDR. As you mentioned, you target the radar.
If I'm remembering right, the radar issue was part of what killed the original system that was being the safeguard system, right? There was an acknowledgement that the radars would simply be blinded. So.
Yep.
Let's see, Eric, you had a couple questions. Let me see if I can unmute you. Yeah, go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. No, just my last question. Since we're talking about EMP weapons as a possible, method to completely defeat ballistic missile defense, and assuming that a lot of this is kind of to protect ourselves from a possible attack from North Korea, is it anywhere close to developing the ICBMs for high atmospheric EMP weapon deployment? Is that such an easy thing to do? I mean, I don't know. I'm actually just asking.
Well, I don't think.
Laura, do you want me to say something about that?
I don't think the EMP weapon is any different than a regular nuclear weapon. The question is whether it has the ICBM to reach, and that's has not been tested. But I will pass that to you, David, and that's your bailiwick.
Yeah, I think what Laura said is right. The concern is that I'm getting some feedback here. All right, let me see if that works better. What Laura said is basically right. The concern is essentially detonating sort of a normal nuclear weapon at high enough altitude that it produces, when you get a EMP burst out of it, and if it's at a high altitude, that covers a wide range. So North Korea does not yet have a working long-range missile that it could reach the United States from, launched from North Korea. You could imagine a scenario that some people have thought about, that if North Korea was able to put, for example, a Nodong missile on a ship and launch something from off the coast, it could either attack a city or it could do a high altitude burst. In either case, if you look at the way the interceptors are supposed to work against a long range missile, they intercept at pretty low altitude, around 200 kilometers or so. And you could imagine, even if you, had a working missile defense system, that North Korea could arrange for the burst to take place at higher altitude than that. So it's possible, even if you were up against a working missile defense system, that you could, an attacker could launch something that still gave an EMP. Is that? Let me just come back to you, Eric.
Yes. No, that does answer the question.
Okay. And Mark, I think you had a question. Just a second. Okay,
Hello?
Mark, you're unmuted. Did you? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, it's kind of a rhetorical question, but I wanted to see what Laura would say about this. So, I just learned this morning that Tulsi Gabbard, who styles herself as a peacenik, even goes to Syria to talk to Assad and denounce U.S. intervention in Syria as if that's a real thing. Is also co-chair of the Missile Defense Caucus, and she signed this awful letter to Trump urging him to go ahead with space-based sensors, East Coast site, and the multi-object kill vehicle. She is a Bernie Sanders supporter, supported by Sierra Club, Emily's List. How do we get to the point where someone like that isn't under any pressure not to be a supporter of missile defense, and apparently a very hawkish one? It used to be a solid, Democrats were not supporters of missile defense, and were very concerned about space weaponization. And this used to be definitely a hawk versus dove issue. And she positioned herself generally as a progressive, a leftist, but apparently feels no pressure on this issue. How did we get to this point?
That's largely rhetorical, right, Mark? Yeah, I don't
know. Yes, I want to know your thoughts about that.
Yeah,
George said he had a comment on this as well. So go ahead, Laura, and then we'll see what George.
I saw Mark's written comment, and I totally appreciate the part about Bernie Sanders. Tulsi Gabbard's a bit of a special case because she represents Hawaii, and there is real constituent concern there. So I think that explains her, but I think the general question is still deserving of a lot of attention.
Well, I think that there's, you're right. I don't know how to create political downside, but they don't feel any political downside. There's no political upside to coming out against missile defense, and there's enormous incentives to reassure the U.S. public as North Korea, continues to develop its nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles, that we've done something, that we're doing something. And this just seems an easy way to do it. And you'll hear, certainly there's concerns about Russia and China, and the concern that U.S. missile defenses will interfere with efforts to continue to reduce nuclear weapons and for us to work together on other issues. Although, at least for Russia, their attention seems to be particularly focused on the European deployments, and you don't hear an awful lot about the GMD system from them. I think they probably know how well it doesn't work. So, there's not a lot of, for missile defense skeptics to say that this is a big problem for Russia and China.
If I can just add, and then I think we're going to have to close down here because it's 1 o'clock. One of the things we've seen is as the public has been sort of told that there are these threats coming from North Korea and Iran, is it's very hard, as Laura said, for representatives and senators to stand up and say, I'm not going to vote for missile defense, since it sounds like missile defense must be a good idea. One of the reasons we decided for this report to look at the question of what have they actually done over the last 14 years in terms of producing this has been to give politicians who question or oppose missile defense something that they can actually talk about in a way that is not going to feel quite as politically sensitive, which is to say, okay, you think this is a good idea. You're going to have to show that it's a good idea because it's costing us a lot of money. It's causing international problems, and let's look back and see where we've gotten to, and that the process that's going on now simply can't continue. So it's part of the idea was to give people a way to start to oppose the program on something where they didn't have to say, I'm not going to vote to protect the country. And we're hoping that now that it's not seen as an Obama system, that it will free some of the Democrats and others potentially up to start asking some of these hard questions, and we'll see whether that happens. As I said, it's basically 1 o'clock. We're pretty much out of time. Laura, thank you very much for this. Thanks everybody for joining us, and we will be back next month and watch for an announcement. So thanks again, Laura.